Hi, everybody. Welcome to Module 4. So in this module, we are going to be talking about how to apply frameworks in research design and in your analytic decisions. So the key point for this module is that a framework is not background context, right? It's a decision-making tool. So it's not just something you have to have, it's something that can really help you if you are intentional about it. So strong studies use the framework from start to finish and so show coherence from research questions through methodology, through findings and discussion. Frameworks actively guide your choices. If the framework doesn't shape the decisions that you're making, it isn't functioning the way it should be. So your framework impacts your research design, including your research questions, your data collection protocols, and your data analysis. So let's start with a brief warm up to start thinking about where you are in the process. It's okay if you don't yet know all of the ways that your framework is shaping/will shape your study, but please just briefly describe one way in which you already see it influencing your design. Okay, so let's start with research questions. We've talked about this already, but your research questions are one of the first places that your framework shows up. Your framework influences how your research questions are constructed. So that isn't to say that you must have chosen your framework prior to identifying your problem or developing your initial research questions. It's similar to how you would think about your methodology. Once you've identified the framework, it's useful to review your questions through that lens and see how it can help you refine your questions and align them with the framing. So, for example, on this slide, if I were conducting a study of how teachers implemented a particular policy, um, one about standards-based grading, for example, my overarching research question might be, how do teachers experience the implementation of a standards-based grading policy? My theoretical framework would make a difference in the specific focus of the study. So, for example, if I were using a sense-making framework, one of my sub-questions might be, or one of my research questions might be, how do teachers interpret and respond to the standards-based grading policy? How, if at all, do they integrate required new practices into their existing classroom practice? So that's very directly aligned to concepts in sense-making, interpretation, integration of new practices into existing practices, all of that kind of thing. Um, for another type of, for another theoretical framework, institutional theory, the focus of the research question might change slightly. So, how do legitimacy pressures shape organizational responses to the standards-based grading policy? How do teachers interpret and respond to these organizational responses? So, it's similar to the sense-making question, but it takes more of an organizational and institutional lens and adds in this idea of legitimacy pressures, which is a key part of institutional theory. If we were taking a critical theoretical lens, the research questions might be focused more on power. So, how do power relations within the school structure influence participation in the implementation of standards-based grading? Or if you were to alternatively take a critical disability theoretical lens, to this study, you might ask, how do teachers interpret and enact standards-based grading in ways that either disrupt or reinforce ableist practices? So the overarching question here, that's kind of the big question. The methodology and then the framework can help focus those questions further. There is a similar process for hypotheses and propositions. So hypotheses are typically associated with quantitative studies and usually experimental ones, though they can be used in any study. Propositions are similar, predictive explanatory statements that are often used in qualitative studies, most often in case studies. But again, propositions can be used across types of methodologies. Essentially, both hypotheses and propositions are predictive statements about the answers to your research questions. For both hypotheses and propositions, your framework can help you identify your variables, constructs, and or any factors that influence your participants, the events. Frameworks don't just explain the findings after the fact, they determine what relationships you would expect to see in the first place. That can support you not only in identifying what data to collect, but also in your analysis, as in either case, you're testing predictions. Not every qualitative study is going to have these sorts of propositions, especially if it's a more emergent design like grounded theory. But propositions and hypotheses can be used in any kind of study, really, and your framework should be influencing those. This all highlights a possible issue to be aware of. So while hypotheses and propositions are predictions and frameworks can guide you, you also have to be open to other possible explanations. So your propositions may not be correct, even if your framework suggests that they would be. So you have to be open to your participants' experiences and be responsive to context and not just kind of ignore things that don't fit. So here are some example hypotheses and propositions grounded in theoretical framing. So example hypotheses, if you were drawing on an intersectionality framework, for example, students positioned within multiple interacting systems of inequity would show stronger negative associations between social media use and life satisfaction. So that could be for a quantitative study. Similarly, if you were using cultural capital theory to study families and students that opt out of mandated testing, an example hypothesis for that could be students who have been historically marginalized are predicted to have lower rates of opt-out than other students, right? And that aligns with what cultural capital as a theory would predict. Some example propositions using a cultural historical activity theory framework, the introduction of new technological devices into the school model is a source of contradiction for teachers. So contradictions, an aspect of a chat framework. And then that integrated chat and sense-making framework, the introduction of new technological devices influences how the object of activity is constructed and reconstructed. So the idea of the object of activity is something from chat. The idea of constructing and reconstructing the understanding of something, that's a sense-making assumption. Okay, so some more examples. Let's dig further into what this could look like for differing theories, drawing on that earlier example of how do teachers experience the implementation of a standards-based grading policy. So for sense-making, right, that same research question, the assumption that's being made there is people interpret change through prior schemas, identities, and emotions. Interpretation drives action. So that's an assumption of sense-making theory. An atheoretical prediction, an atheoretical proposition could be teachers will respond differently to the reform, right? So that's a prediction, but it's not directly aligned with sense-making theory. Some theory-grounded propositions could be teachers' interpretations of standards-based grading will vary based on prior beliefs and experiences, right? That's what sense-making would predict. Or teachers whose teaching philosophies align with standards-based grading requirements will integrate new practices into their existing practice. So again, that's that idea of assimilation in a sense-making framework. A theory-grounded hypothesis could be as reported alignment between reform goals and existing beliefs increase, implementation fidelity will also increase. So that could be a correlational study hypothesis. Similar for institutional theory. So that institutional theory research question, how do legitimacy pressures shape organizational responses to the standards-based grading policy? How do teachers interpret and respond to these organizational responses? The assumption associated with those research questions for institutional theory is organizations seek legitimacy and conform to external pressures through isomorphism, which is another key part of institutional theory. An atheoretical proposition or prediction could be schools will change their practices after the policy. Okay. Theory-grounded propositions look a little bit different. Schools and teachers will adopt visible practices that signal compliance with external mandates. So that's informed directly by institutional theory. Or symbolic changes may occur without substantive instructional shifts. So that idea of symbolic changes, which is referred to as decoupling or loose coupling in institutional theory, that is informed by institutional theory. And then some hypotheses, schools facing stronger regulatory oversight will show greater structural conformity to policy requirements, or policy adoption will be associated with symbolic artifacts more often than classroom practice changes. And then critical disability theory. So again, the research question, how do teachers interpret and enact standards-based grading in ways that either disrupt or reinforce ableist practices? The theory assumption from critical disability theory, power structures and institutional norms define ability according to narrow standards of normal, quotation marks, independent, and productive. And these norms systematically advantage non-disabled students while marginalizing disabled students. Educational policies and practices often reproduce ableism unless intentionally redesigned. Educational policies and everyday practices construct, quote, ability through norms of speed, independence, compliance, and standardization. Teachers' interpretations of grading policy can reproduce or challenge these ableist norms. So that would be an assumption driven by critical disability theory. An atheoretical proposition could be teachers vary in how they implement standards-based grading practices. So that might be true, but it's not grounded in any particular theoretical framework. Theory-grounded propositions. Teachers' definitions of mastery, quote, mastery, may reflect dominant assumptions about, quote, normal pace and mode of performance. Teachers' beliefs about fairness and rigor may shape whether accommodations are viewed as equity or as lowering standards. Teachers who adopt accessibility-oriented or universal design perspectives may enact grading practices that disrupt these norms. So those are propositions that could be grounded in the actual theory. Some hypotheses: teachers' endorsement of ableist beliefs will be negatively correlated with the use of flexible or accessible grading practices, or after controlling for years of experience in subject area, teachers with stronger equity or disability-informed beliefs will report greater use of flexible assessment options. So that's a regression analysis hypothesis. So let's talk now about methods, analysis, and interpretation. So this is the next big piece of your study that your framework can and should guide. So frameworks alongside the requirements of your methodology should inform data collection, including variables, sample, surveys, protocols, instruments, as well as your data analysis. So coding, memoing, what types of analyses you're running in a quantitative study, presentation of results and findings, interpretation and discussion of results and findings. So it's threaded through all of this. This is one way that you can conceptualize these ideas, and one way that you can present this, both in assignments for this class and in your dissertation. This was an appendix from my dissertation. So in this example, I took specific concepts from cultural historical activity theory to inform and frame my research questions. So this idea of systemic contradictions and how teachers respond to contradictions. And then also sense making. How do existing schemas influence how teachers respond to tensions and contradictions? So that's a mix of sense making and chat. So that those research questions are informed by theory. And then that was used to develop data collection protocols, observations points, the types of documents that I was going to collect. So this idea of challenges was related to tensions and contradictions. Response to challenges was related to sense making and tensions and contradictions. This idea of expectations for roles is related to sense making and the idea of schemas. And then in observations, looking for dilemmas, conflicts, and then these types of documents to look at change over time, again, related to chat and the idea of the activity system and how that changes over time. So this table is just a way that you can demonstrate visually how your framework has informed your research questions, your data collection processes. There could be additional columns added to this to look at your coding, for example, or other forms of analysis and how that's related as well. So this is one way to present this. Your framework is also critical in guiding your analysis. So, for example, in a qualitative study, you can create codes based on the components of the theoretical framework and then sort the data into those predetermined theory-based categories. So theory-based codes from institutional theory, for example, might include things like isomorphism or decoupling, as I mentioned earlier. For sense-making, as in the example on this slide, this slide really just shows kind of the different forms of codes that were developed toward creating findings or creating finding statements from the findings that were discovered in the course of the analysis, and then explaining the findings. So for sense making is in this example, assimilation here would be a code, a theory code that is developed from the theoretical framework that could then be applied to data in which you see evidence of teachers making sense of a reform by assimilating new requirements into existing practices. So the example on this slide shows this as a later step in analysis, but it may differ depending on your methodology. And I'm going to talk about this more in just a second, but this theory code, applying this code of assimilation to the data in which you're seeing assimilation, can lead to the explanation of the findings that you're identifying throughout the course of your analysis. So your framework helps you move from analysis to interpretation to reporting results and or findings. So here's what the process looks like. So this is an extension of the study presented in the previous slide. So the raw data is an observation. This is an observation. You can see the codes that were applied in purple text. They're also identified in brackets. Both the theory and the literature inform this analysis. So it can be your theoretical framework and or your conceptual framework, and also the literature. So for example, the code assimilation again here is applied to data that provides an example of a teacher incorporating new practices into existing schema/practices. So in this instance, it was ultimately an example of the teacher engaging in ability grouping, which is a practice she had previously used, but was reframing as reacting to real-time data. This led to the finding statement, real-time data analysis encourages ability grouping here. I personally find it helpful to make these kinds of finding statements versus just identifying, one word or short phrase themes. You do not have to do that. Not everyone does. It just, for me, it helps me to push the analysis a little bit further and really clarify what it is that I'm saying, and what I think the participants are saying. So then, reflecting on what the theoretical framework assumes, real-time data analysis encourages ability grouping. That finding statement becomes a theoretically informed explanation of findings here. So teachers made sense of the demands of real-time data analysis through a process of assimilation. Rather than reconstructing their existing beliefs about teaching, they used new practices, real-time data analysis and data transparency, to facilitate old practices, ability grouping. So here the framework provides the explanation for why. Theoretically guided memoing in response to research questions, propositions, hypotheses, is how you can get from raw data to data grounded and theoretically informed finding and explanations. So this is true whether you're doing a quantitative study, a mixed method study, or a qualitative study. I like to do my memoing, sorry about that. I like to do my memoing in response to questions. So I like to do a process of analytic questioning. The framework you're using can help to inform those questions. So here, my analytic questions were, why did things happen as they did? What can we learn from these findings? All of these questions in purple here are analytic questions for me to make sense of the data. Beyond coding, the theoretical framework offers the framing for making sense of what you found in the data. So here we got to that theory-based explanation of findings through this memoing process. So just remember, theory is the answer to the question why. It provides an explanation. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you're using your theory to help you explain what's happening in the data. To kind of hammer that home, ultimately your framework should help you make sense of your findings. And you can do that by asking theoretically informed analytic questions of the data, as I showed you in the previous slide. You can do it by developing short phrases, connecting the results or the findings to the theoretical framework and to the existing research. This is not just for qualitative studies. This is for mixed method studies. It's for quantitative studies. It doesn't matter. You should still be doing this analytic process of memoing to understand what it is that how are you getting from the raw data to the findings, and then what do the findings mean? How are you explaining them within the theoretical framing? Interpreting the data through those theoretical lenses can help researchers to make sense of and explain the findings, explore whether and how the findings converge or diverge from the literature and the theory. And that can support researchers in identifying precisely how their study contributes to the literature and in building a more nuanced argument. So just a few guiding questions on the next couple of slides. So guiding questions for applying a theoretical framework. How does my framework explain my findings? Why did they happen? Why did things happen as they did? How do my findings fit within my theoretical framework? Are there places where my findings do not fit? What does that mean? Why might that be? What, if any, are my theoretical contributions? Based on what my study demonstrated, is there anything that should be added to the existing theoretical framework? How do my findings alter the framework? So as I mentioned earlier, you need to be open to results that don't fit within your framework. But you can't stop there, right? You have to understand why that might be as well, and you have to communicate that in your findings and discussion. And then finally, theory should help guide you in making clear recommendations for research, policy, and or practice. We'll talk more about this later in this course, but here are a few guiding questions for now for that as well. What should future researchers on this topic study? How should they study it? How, if at all, should existing policy change because of the findings of the study? Should new policy be created? What should it look like? Should existing policy be revised? How? Based on the findings, what should policymakers do? What are some recommendations for practice or practitioners in this area? What changes to practice should be made? How should these changes be made? By whom? What questions remain to be answered? So your theoretical framework can guide you in answering these questions. So for example, question number 7 on this slide asks what changes should be made, how, and by whom. Certain theoretical frameworks can help you identify the levers of change or point you to the most effective change agents so that you can then make those recommendations very clearly. Okay, so in closing, I would like for you to write a quick theory-informed hypothesis or proposition. So this can be a predicted response to one of your research questions. What does your framework say will happen?